Thank you, Bob. Our next speaker is Professor Brenda Schaefer. She's a specialist in energy and foreign policy, energy security policies, Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, Caspian energy, and Eastern Mediterranean energy issues. She speaks countless number of languages that you don't even know exist. She currently is a visiting researcher at Georgetown University. She's on sabbatical from the University of Haifa, where she's a professor in the School of Political Science. She previously served as the research director of the Caspian Studies program at Harvard University. She's also the author of a number of books, including Energy Politics in 2009. Brenda, please.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. No matter how many times our students will learn that oil prices work in cycles, that nothing cures low oil prices like low oil prices. We always think that what's happening now is here to stay. And I really welcome Bob's presentation. I'd like to follow up with some of the implications of these cycles for the Middle East. So what we have to remember, as much as we think that that the real crisis is these extremely low oil prices, what we're doing today, we've had the last 2 years the largest drops in the history of tracking oil and new investments in oil production. So essentially, when we usually prepare for the future with investments, demand is going up around the world. At the same time, investments are going down in new oil. And as much as we really, I think there's many policymakers in Israel and in the United States that are very happy about OPEC being dead, OPEC not being able to be an actor in the market, a significant actor. The meaning that OPEC is dead is meaning we have no adult supervision in the market. And there's really no one. OPEC traditionally, a positive aspect of their behavior was they planned for future demand. They wanted to keep us in the era of oil, so they planned for the demand. Well, that planning isn't taking place on the finance side, and we will see the implications for that in future prices. Well, in terms of the interaction between the Middle East and the oil price, one observation is that oil is not as sensitive as in the past to developments in the Middle East. One is that in such a liquid oil market in general, the price is not so responsive to geopolitical events at all. But specifically, I think because we have much more knowledge about how the specific events can or cannot affect the movement or production of oil, the market has learned to not respond so much to events in the Middle East. So for instance, if you have demonstrations in Egypt, potential instability, if it's not going to affect ships going through the Suez Canal, it's not going to be factored into oil. So we've seen in this current period of the price cycle a lot less responsiveness to events in the Middle East being reflected in the oil price. But at the same time, I think we might be underestimating in the oil price potential instability in the Middle East, because whether we like it or not, this is the mother lode of oil. And the type of events, for instance, things that many experts in this room on the Middle East, things that we can easily imagine, for instance, a hotter proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So the two biggest producers in the region suddenly using terrorism, using proxy movements to undermine each other's oil industries. This is not a fantasy. This is not a dream. This is a very realistic scenario. And I think it's quite poo-pooed by most experts, most policymakers. Well, Saudi Arabia and Iran aren't really going to go to war. They probably won't go to war, but they both have a history of using terror, using militias, supporting proxies to undermine each other. Another thing, North Africa. Most of the attacks of ISIS and other militia groups there have been focused on the energy infrastructure. We should look carefully at these attacks, for instance, on the Algerian energy infrastructure, the two in the last year. They've been quite successful, high number of deaths. They've been able to disable important installations. We have ports, oil ports going offline in Libya on a regular basis. So it's enough, even if you don't have a government falling, but you can have specific targets on energy infrastructure in North Africa. I think that's going to be something to watch. Will have implications not just for the oil price, but also for gas supplies into Europe, especially with Algeria being an important supplier. Another aspect is the chicken and the egg. Well, yes, the Middle East producers are having less income right now, and this can cause instability in many of the countries, and that in itself can bring to falls in production, and that in the end can jack up the oil price. That's why it's very dynamic, and that's why people like ourselves can write books and have a career and stuff thanks to all these changes. So where do we expect the chicken or the egg to be affected by the price and the oil price? Let's say $50 oil continues for another year, more or less around $50 oil. And also just to point out that we're not in an historically low oil price period. What was the exception with 2010, 2012, which was an exceptionally high period. And actually from most of the late 60s until today, the oil price has averaged at around $31 in today's dollars. So 50 is actually relatively robust. So let's say a year goes ahead of oil price projection. Well, most commonly, many analysts, when they try to see who's going to have economic or potential instability, they look at the gap between the balanced budget and the income anticipated from oil. It's very simplistic and doesn't really give you a good picture, because most of the major producers have learned from the 1980s crash, and they plan for the cycles in the oil price, and you can see that they're much better prepared for this relatively low part of the oil price cycle than they were in the 1980s when the crash took place. So who's vulnerable? First thing, it's the most vulnerable actually are countries outside the Middle East, Venezuela, Nigeria, Angola, that do not have the type of currency reserves that can allow them to sustain a gap in the budget. And actually among the non-OPEC that have strong currency reserves and actually will probably be able to relatively well to weather this part of the price cycle is actually Russia, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan. And these are also countries that Israel has very intensive interaction and relations, and their economies seem to be weathering this crisis better than most had anticipated. Where in the Middle East we should anticipate countries to have a special difficulty in terms of the huge gap between the oil price and their balanced budget and having small reserves would be actually Iraq and Iran. Okay, and this might be good news for some people in the room that it includes Iran, but as much as we're talking about Iran getting back most of its reserves, its currency reserves, and all the money it has actually has more debt than actually the money it's about to, or it's receiving, it's being unfrozen. And it has entered the energy market, the oil market, and gas markets, regional gas markets as well, at the least opportune time that's really possible in the past 7 years. And so actually where you might, if we look at this same formula of oil price versus balanced budget versus currency reserves, one of the more vulnerable countries to instability is Iran, certainly Iraq, certainly also Iraqi Kurdistan, and to a certain extent also Algeria. And again, Algeria, not only oil producer, but a very important gas producer, especially for Europe. And I think there is a lesson. There's a lesson also for Israel as Israel goes ahead and thinks about being a gas exporter. Prices move in cycles. You have to prepare your economy, or if you even want to be a part of that cycle. This sort of circular. Most energy-producing economies are trying to de-link themselves from these cycles. Do you want to be a part of these cycles? So I hope we can develop this during discussion. Thank you.